Have you ever been on a first date from hell? I'm talking about the kind that leaves you shaking in your boots, with chills running down your spine. Maybe you've been able to shake it off, but for some unlucky souls, those memories keep them awake at night. In the world of dating apps, you may think you know someone from their online profile, but the truth is, you never really know until you meet them in person. Brace yourself for these spine-chilling dating app horror stories that'll make you think twice before swiping right on a stranger. I'm a 37-year-old female and a successful entrepreneur. You'd think I was pretty smart and have always had my life all figured out, but when it came to my dating life, let's just say I've made some pretty terrible choices, especially in my early 20s. This particular story happened when I was just 23 and fresh out of college. I had recently moved to Utah from my parents' house in Michigan. Being from a reserved Asian family, it was a big step for me to move out and start my own business. Although I was in a long-distance relationship at the time, things weren't really going well between my boyfriend and I. In fact, we hadn't spoken in weeks, and it was obvious that we had both just given up on the relationship. Most of my new friends in Utah were already in relationships, which made me feel a little bit like an outsider and pretty lonely. So I decided to try out some dating apps. I mean, why not, right? After a few weeks on the app and a couple of awkward dates, I matched with a 27-year-old Asian man named Bing, who was a business tycoon. At least, that's what his profile said. Now, here's where things started getting weird. Bing refused to do any video calls with me, wouldn't meet me in a public place, and insisted that I come to his place for our first date. I knew I should have seen the red flags popping up, but I tried to convince myself that it was nothing out of the ordinary. I was just really desperate, I guess. Feeling nervous about the date, I told two of my friends about it and gave them Bing's address, just in case. That evening, I drove for over 45 minutes to the address he had given me, and my GPS was the only thing guiding me as I navigated the unfamiliar territory. When I got closer and approached what seemed like a bush path off the main road, I felt nothing but dread. Honestly, I just wanted to turn back and leave. Suddenly, I got a call from Bing asking where I was. I told him about the bush path to confirm if that was the right path, and he said yes. As I hung up the phone, my instincts literally screamed at me to turn around and leave. Call me crazy, but you know what? For whatever reason, I drove on past the tall trees and bushes into what turned out to be a desolate and isolated area. There were no streetlights, and the only source of illumination came from my car's headlights. I couldn't help but wonder why my date had chosen to live in such a remote and, frankly, eerie location, so far from civilization. I was startled that my GPS tracker notified me that I had actually arrived at my destination. I looked up to see a house in front with two cars parked outside. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I drove my car past one of the cars parked outside to the front door of the house to get a better look. I called Bing and told him I was outside. He told me to come in, but I insisted that he should come outside so I could see him first. At this point, I got really angry, mostly at myself, and realized just how careless and dumb I was to come all the way out here to meet a man who had given me nothing but red flags from the beginning. I sat there in the car with my heart pounding in my chest and my foot still on the gas, ready to take off if I sensed any danger. I remember thinking, the last thing I'm going to do is step out of this car. Then I got a text from him saying, "Turn off the car and come in. You didn't come all the way here to sit in your car, did you?" That was it. I stepped on the gas and drove forward, planning to make a U-turn and just leave. But just as I did, the light came on from one of the cars parked behind me. It was actually a big truck with tinted glass, and the person behind the wheel slammed into my car, swerving back, blocking the road and preventing me from leaving. It was a trap, and Bing was definitely not who he claimed to be. In that moment of complete shock, my survival instincts kicked in. I mean, I was like a stunt driver behind the wheel. I don't even know where it came from. The truck was blocking most of the road, but there was still a little space. And since I was driving a small car, I slammed on the gas and managed to squeeze through. Once I'd done that, I kept driving until I reached the highway, and thankfully, the truck didn't follow me. It was an absolutely terrifying experience. My car was, of course, pretty beat up, but at least I made it home alive. Looking back on it now, I can't believe how stupidly naive I was to put myself in such a dangerous situation. As a 26-year-old female who was brought up in a tight-knit family where communication and quality time were top priority, I always had my reservations about dating apps. To me, they seemed like a breeding ground for people who had nothing meaningful to offer except casual hookups, and that was definitely not what I was looking for. But then, two of my closest friends found their soulmates through dating apps. They had the kind of love that would make anyone jealous, and it got me thinking, maybe I was too quick to judge? So after breaking up with my boyfriend a couple of months ago, I decided to take a leap of faith and give dating apps a try. One night after a nice dinner and a soothing bath, I got into bed and downloaded one of the more popular dating apps. I set up my profile and began swiping to find a match. After about 30 minutes, I found a decent match. His name was Damien. He was a good-looking man in his late 30s who lived about 20 minutes away from me. He caught my attention because he was a vet and I'm a huge animal lover. We started chatting and soon after we planned to meet for dinner at a local restaurant downtown. I got to the restaurant 15 minutes early, and as I waited for him to arrive, I couldn't help but feel nervous. I'd never been on a blind date before, and the thought of meeting a complete stranger made me a little anxious. When he finally walked in, I immediately recognized his face, but he didn't look as tall as he stated on his profile. In fact, he was way shorter than I had imagined, and he seemed to have put on quite a bit of weight. I was disappointed, and for a moment I considered sneaking out through the second exit door before he could spot me. But before I could make my move, he spotted me. As soon as he took his seat, he called for the waitress and began to place his order. And then he asked me to order whatever I wanted. When I ordered a salad, he glared at me and said, "You're way too skinny to be eating a salad, don't you think?" Before I could even respond, he ordered me a steak and some garlic mashed potatoes. As we waited for the food to arrive, I tried to make small talk, but he seemed more interested in his phone than in getting to know me. Throughout the meal, we ate in awkward silence. I made another attempt to start a conversation. I asked him about his career as a vet, but he didn't seem interested in even having a conversation. He just kept stuffing his mouth with food, making loud noises while he was chewing. We finished our meal, and although I offered to pay, he insisted on paying. We headed out of the restaurant when he blurted out words that have never made me feel so humiliated. "So, my place or your place?" I was taken aback by the question, and he continued. "Look, let's not waste any time pretending like we both don't know what this date was for. I took you out on a date even though you're not even really my type. We had a nice meal, which I paid for, so what's it gonna be?" I was shocked, speechless. I was feeling disgusted and humiliated by his words. I was thinking, who does this guy think he is? Like I owe him something because he paid for a cheap steak and a glass of wine? I was always taught to take the high ground, so with all the politeness I could muster, I told him that I appreciated the dinner but wasn't interested in anything further and just wanted to go home. I didn't even wait for his answer and walked straight to my car as he yelled profanities at me. As I was driving home, I noticed a white truck following me closely for over 10 minutes. I took different turns to see if the car was following me, and to my shock, it was. The last thing I wanted was some maniac to know my home address, so I continued to drive, taking different turns until I arrived at a police station. While I was at the police station, he sent me a text saying, "You can run, but you cannot hide." I was so terrified, I quickly blocked him and uninstalled the dating app. An officer offered to escort me home, but I was too afraid to go home that night. I called my brother, who lived about 45 minutes away, and he came to get me from the police station. I stayed over at his place that night and even stayed for a couple more days just to make sure the coast was clear before I went home. I was so shaken by the experience that I promised myself I would never use a dating app again. I used to be one of those guys who turned to dating apps to have a fun time. Nothing too serious, if you know what I mean. Don't get me wrong, I always made sure that any girl I went out with was totally into it and gave her full consent. I am not one of those guys who takes advantage of people. But sometimes, even with all the best intentions, things can go really wrong. It all started with a swipe right on a dating app. Her name was Sarah, and she seemed nice enough from her pictures and profile. After a few messages back and forth, we decided to meet up for drinks. See if there's any chemistry between us. To my surprise, the date went really well. We laughed, we talked, we had a great time, and when I asked her if she wanted to come back to my place, she said yes. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of bacon and eggs. I rubbed my eyes and saw Sarah already in the kitchen, cooking up a storm. I was a bit taken aback. I didn't expect her to still be here, but like I said, she seemed nice enough, so I thanked her for making me breakfast. I politely told her she really didn't need to do that and that she could leave, but she refused. She said she wanted to stay a little bit longer. I didn't really feel comfortable leaving a total stranger in my house all alone, but I had to leave for work, so I reluctantly left her there alone. When I got back home, I was shocked to find Sarah still there. And not only that, but she had cooked, cleaned, and even done my laundry. I was grateful, but also totally freaked out. I thanked her and asked her to leave, but she again refused. I offered her money. She said no. The next day, when I came back home from work, Sarah was still there. She had clearly made herself at home, and she didn't look like she was planning on leaving anytime soon. I thanked her for everything as nicely as I could, but I told her it was time for her to go. At this point, this was way beyond uncomfortable. This was not what I'd signed up for. I tried to reason with her, but she would not budge. After 2 days of this, I called the cops. When they arrived, Sarah put on an act that still gives me chills to this day. She claimed that we had been dating for over a year and that she had just had a miscarriage and that I was trying to kick her out. The cops bought her story and told me that we had to work it out on our own. I'll never forget how the female cop looked at me with total disgust. The next day when I was at work, a colleague of mine told me that a woman was looking for me. I didn't even have to ask. I knew. It was Sarah. She'd found my workplace and decided to torment me further. She had brought lunch for me and told my colleagues that she was my girlfriend. They were surprised to see her and teased me about finally having a new girlfriend. But I just smiled. I wasn't ready to explain this situation to anyone. The whole thing continued for a few more days. Sarah would not leave, no matter how much money I offered her or how much I begged and pleaded. She kept insisting that we were together now and that I was lucky to have her in my life. After a few more days of this, I got back home from work one day, and she was just gone. No note, no explanation, no trace. And surprisingly, nothing was missing. It's been 8 months now, and I still haven't heard anything from her. I still wonder whatever happened to her. Freaky as the whole thing was, she obviously needed help. I hope she's okay. But whenever I hear a knock at the door, I'm still afraid I'm going to find her on my doorstep.